Lian Zhou stood at the front of the lecture hall, trying to suppress the giddiness that only a physicist who had just cracked the code to a universal truth could experience. The hum of the air conditioning buzzed like a constant reminder of the room's sterile nature, a little too clinical for a place that was supposed to foster intellectual curiosity. Before him, a group of university professors and space research officers sat, their faces a mixture of skepticism and quiet anticipation. Lian was used to this look. Academia had always been a place of whispered doubts and unspoken critiques, but he had just discovered something that could silence them all. A theory that explained not just the fabric of gravity, but how it could be bent, controlled, and, if done correctly, tuned. Gentlemen and ladies, he began, his voice filled with mock reverence. What I present today is a minor discovery. One that you will, of course, dismiss at first, and then, when your peer-reviewed journals are finally published, you'll claim it was your idea all along. It's how academia works. But let's talk about the real fun stuff. Gravitational anomalies. And no, this isn't about space-time bending or black holes. It's far simpler. We're talking about, his sentence was cut off by a loud crack in the air, so sudden and sharp it sounded like the universe itself had taken a deep breath and then snapped its fingers. Lian's eyes narrowed, an instinctive understanding flickering across his mind, but it was too late. The world around him tilted, the air began to ripple in strange waves, like heat rising off a desert road. His feet left the floor. Papers scattered from his desk, caught in a wind that didn't belong. The walls of the lecture hall, normally so solid, warped like rubber, and then, everything went black. Lian woke to a strange sensation, like floating, but not in water. More like a slow-motion crash into an ocean of cold metal. He blinked, disoriented. For a moment, he thought he was back in his apartment, eyes half closed from a hangover, but no, the smell wasn't right. There were no coffee cups, no clutter of dirty dishes on the table. Instead, there was an uncomfortably clean sterility, like a hospital. Only, Lian was pretty sure hospitals didn't have this many people wearing military-grade uniforms. He tried to sit up, but his head spun, and a sharp pain pierced his temples. A voice rang out, authoritative, and from somewhere above him, "Dr. Zhou," the voice said. "You're awake. You're safe. Can you hear me?" Lian's eyes slowly focused on the face above him. Commander Ji Shuang. He'd heard of her, everyone in the scientific community had. An exoplanetary commander turned fleet leader. A force of nature who could command an entire armada of ships with nothing more than a glance. But here, she was kneeling beside him, concern creasing her otherwise stoic face. "Where?" Lian's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Where am I?" "You're aboard the Epoch, an exploration vessel," Ji replied. Her voice was calm, unshaken by the panic that Lian felt beginning to rise in his chest. "We were en route to the outer rim when the anomaly hit." Lian blinked. The outer rim? He shook his head, trying to make sense of it. Anomaly? What happened? You tell me, Doctor. The gravitational flux you detected, do you remember that? Ji asked. She gestured to a nearby console, where a holographic display blinked to life. It showed a map of space, with ripples, distortions, and fluctuations bouncing around it. We've been tracking gravitational waves for months now. They were small at first. But they've been growing. The kind of disturbance you thought might only exist in theory, it's real. Lian's heart skipped a beat as the words sank in. He'd always theorized it, hell, he'd written whole papers on it. But to see it materialized like this, to feel the universe twist in front of him like a soap bubble, he couldn't deny it. This was something worse than he'd ever imagined. The rift you predicted is more than just an anomaly, Ji continued, her tone grim. It's an event horizon. A singularity. And we're losing control. Whole star systems are collapsing. We need you to help stabilize it. Lian felt his body stiffen. The air was suffocating. Wait, what do you mean, stabilize it? I'm no hero. I don't even know how I got here. Before he could finish his sentence, the room seemed to tilt again. The holographic display flickered, and the ship trembled, sending him sprawling onto the cold floor. G's voice barely reached his ears, as though her words were carried through water. You're the only one who can do it. The next few days were a blur. Lien tried to make sense of his new reality, but there was no time for clarity. The universe had seemingly cracked open, spilling chaos in every direction. He was confined to the ship, its sterile walls and military-grade technology doing little to soothe his anxiety. Every time he tried to comprehend the scope of what was happening, the room would warp again, as if the ship itself was living inside a giant tesseract. When Lien wasn't recovering from the debilitating dizziness caused by gravitational distortion, he was thrown into simulations, trying to replicate what had caused the anomaly. Commander Ji Shuang stood over his shoulder, her sharp eyes never leaving him. She was always there, always watching. At first, it felt like a suffocating presence. But over time, Lien came to realize that her focus wasn't a threat, it was protection. The weight of her expectations was nothing compared to the weight of the universe collapsing on itself. He had no choice but to rise to the occasion. Lien threw himself into the work, albeit begrudgingly. His theories were no longer abstract. They were now his lifeline. Gravity wasn't just a force, it was a battlefield. If he didn't learn how to control it, they would all be lost. But the more he studied the singularity, this anomaly that seemed to be devouring everything in its path, the more he realized just how little he understood. The equations were far from settled, the math was incomplete, and the technology he had at his disposal was only a fraction of what was needed to fight back. There was one thing, however, that Lien had always been good at: keeping his sense of humor. Even in the face of death, Lien cracked jokes, often to the annoyance of his fellow scientists. If we're about to get sucked into a cosmic black hole, he said one afternoon, staring at a monitor as it flashed readings of a nearby star system nearing its death, at least I won't have to pay rent anymore. It wasn't funny. But it was enough to make Commander G smile, even if she refused to admit it. She gave him a pointed look, but there was a small glimmer of warmth in her gaze. Lien continued his work, slowly unraveling the mysteries of the singularity. He learned that in order to stabilize the gravitational field, he would need to create an opposing force. A counterweight, if you will. It was like trying to balance a massive planet on the tip of a needle. Only this needle was the ship, and the planet was an entire galaxy. Lien sat in front of a large, interactive holographic display, his fingers moving across the projected images like a pianist navigating complex scales. The ship's artificial gravity had stabilized after the earlier turbulence, but it was hard to shake the feeling that the universe around them had entered some new, dangerous rhythm. A subtle hum from the engine, the occasional flicker of the lights, and the unnatural quiet of the crew, all signaled that something was off. His thoughts were consumed by the singularity, the massive gravitational force that had already started tearing apart whole sectors of space. The universe was collapsing in on itself, and he was the only one who could prevent it. The pressure was unbearable, and yet every time he thought he understood the problem, a new wrinkle would emerge, an unexpected shift in the gravitational field that threw all his calculations off. Lien, G's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, calm but with an edge of urgency. We're approaching the affected zone. The anomaly's instability is getting worse. We need to move quickly. Lien glanced up at the commander, who stood in the doorway to his small lab. Her face was impassive, but the shadows beneath her eyes told a different story. They'd all been working around the clock, but G had been pushing herself the hardest. She didn't show it, but Lien could see it, just beneath the surface. I know, he said, turning his attention back to the hologram. We're running out of time. If the singularity's pull is as strong as the data suggests, we'll be in its range within hours. We don't have hours, she replied sharply. We have minutes. And you're the only one who can do this. So, make it work. Lien swallowed, resisting the urge to snap back with some sarcastic remark. This wasn't the time for jokes. The math was too complicated, too volatile, and his mind kept wandering back to the thought of Earth. He'd severed every connection to it. No more emails, no more messages to friends or family. He'd sacrificed his place in the world for the sake of a universe that didn't even care whether he existed. The thought of never feeling the soil of his home again, never seeing the faces of those he loved, he shoved the feeling down, focusing on the task at hand. A sudden jolt from the ship reminded him that they were, indeed, closing in on the epicenter of the disturbance. The epoch rumbled and swayed as they passed through the outer edge of the affected space. Around them, the stars seemed to shimmer strangely, their light bending in unnatural ways, as though the fabric of the universe was being stretched to its breaking point. "This is it," Lien muttered to himself. "This is what I've been preparing for." He adjusted the settings on the holographic display, keying in new parameters as fast as his fingers could move. Gravity wasn't just a mathematical equation anymore. It was a battlefield, an unstable, shifting terrain that he had to navigate in real time. The equations that once filled his notebooks now seemed childish, irrelevant. He was no longer just manipulating gravity. He had to become it. "What's the status on the fleet?" Lien asked, trying to steady his nerves, deploying emergency stabilizers around the core. G answered, "Moving closer. But without your input, it's just a matter of time before the singularity overwhelms them." Lien nodded. His mind was racing, trying to piece together everything he had learned, everything he had imagined. The anomaly wasn't just a gravitational force. It was alive. It was growing. The more energy it consumed, the stronger it became, and the more unstable the universe around it grew. "You're sure you're ready for this?" G asked, her voice softer now, her gaze not leaving him. For a moment, Lien wondered if the commander's resolve was faltering, but then he saw the glint of something else in her eyes, something like a faint trust. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he focused on the data streaming across the holographic interface, his mind calculating, shifting, correcting. He had to trust his instincts, the same instincts that had brought him to this moment. He wasn't just a scientist anymore. He was a bridge between the cosmos and the Earth he'd left behind. The weight of the task was heavy, but there was no other option. He couldn't allow the universe to collapse, not without giving everything he had. "I'll do it," he finally said, his voice firm despite the swirl of uncertainty inside him. "But I need you to prepare the ship for full gravitational recalibration. I'll need full control of the vessel's systems, and I can't do this without your help." "Consider it done," G said, her expression turning resolute. She turned to leave the lab but paused at the door. "Lien, if we don't make it." "Don't say that," Lien interrupted, cutting her off. "We're going to make it. We have to." G didn't respond. She simply gave him a nod, her lips pressing together in a tight line, and then she was gone. Lien sat back in his chair, taking a deep breath. The silence in the lab was deafening, but his thoughts were louder. For a long moment, he just stared at the data, letting his mind drift over the calculations, the possibilities, the consequences of failure. Then, without another word, he stood, his hands moving mechanically as he initiated the recalibration sequence. The ship's lights dimmed for a moment, and the hum of the engines changed pitch as the gravitational systems began to adjust. He wasn't just manipulating the ship's artificial gravity. He was syncing it with the very forces that threatened to tear apart the universe. Lien's heart beat faster as the intensity of the task grew. Every ounce of his energy was focused now, his mind shutting out the fear, the doubts, everything except for the singularity. The hologram before him began to glow brighter, its projections expanding like a living thing. The singularity was approaching, and Lien was the only one who could stop it. He wasn't just stabilizing a force. He was engaging in a cosmic dance, one that could either save everything, or end it all. The ship groaned beneath him as it shifted closer to the event horizon. The stars outside seemed to distort even more, their light twisting into unnatural arcs. The gravitational waves were building, rising with a terrifying force. Lien's body ached as the strain of manipulating such a massive amount of energy began to take its toll. Sweat beaded on his forehead, but he didn't stop. Not now, just a little longer, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the growing noise of the ship's systems. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he calibrated the final adjustment, focusing on the gravity anchor he had designed, a theoretical structure that could, theoretically, pull the singularity back from the brink, stabilizing its energy output. The problem was, he had no idea if it would work. The room around him seemed to ripple as the gravitational fields intensified. His hands ached, but he kept moving, making the final adjustments, feeding the ship's systems with the necessary energy. It was a gamble. A huge gamble. But there was no turning back. Now, he shouted, his voice cracking as he activated the final sequence. For a moment, everything stopped. Time seemed to freeze as the gravitational energy built and built. Then, with a violent whump, the space around them exploded in a burst of light and sound. The force of the singularity clashed against the anchor, and for a second, Lien thought the universe might just tear itself apart. Then, slowly, everything began to calm, the stars outside returned to their normal state, the cosmic distortions dissipating like smoke. The shaking of the ship stopped. Lien slumped forward, his hands still on the controls, his body weak from the strain. He could hear his own ragged breathing, the sound filling the silence left behind. It was done. The singularity had been stabilized, but the cost had been high. Lien felt a sharp pang of emptiness, the echo of the void that had opened up inside him. He had done what no one else could have done. But in doing so, he had lost everything. His connection to Earth, to his old life, was gone. The decision to stabilize the universe had come at an unfathomable cost. And as the ship drifted in the aftermath, Lien realized that he was no longer just a man. He was the anchor, the tether that held this new universe together, and there would be no going back. The moment the gravitational waves subsided, a profound silence enveloped the ship. Lien sat at the helm, his hands still gripping the control panels, but they were numb now, as though the universe itself had drained the last ounce of energy from his body. He couldn't focus on anything but the ringing in his ears, a dull hum that was slowly starting to fade. It felt like his consciousness was being sucked into a void, weightless, suspended between moments of time, caught between the pull of the cosmos and the confines of his own body. His head sagged forward, and for a moment, he allowed himself to breathe in the quiet. The storm had passed. The universe was, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, stable again. But at what cost, Lien? Ji's voice was soft but insistent, a lifeline thrown into the storm of his thoughts. He turned his head slowly, lifting it from his hands, and saw her standing there, her figure framed by the dim light of the ship's hallway. Her uniform was unruffled, her hair still perfectly in place, but the exhaustion in her eyes was unmistakable. "How is it?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual, as if she already knew the answer. Lien shook his head slowly, not trusting his own voice at first. He tried to push himself up from the console but found his body unwilling to comply. The ship felt like it was spinning around him, and yet everything seemed eerily still. I think it worked." His words were hoarse, as though they'd been dragged from the depths of his chest. "The singularity's stable. The gravitational waves have normalized." Ji's eyes softened for just a second before she moved to his side, kneeling down in front of him. She reached out, her hand lightly touching his arm, and the contact jolted through him like an electric shock. He looked at her, his vision slightly unfocused, but he could make out the concern in her expression, even if she was trying to hide it. "You did it," she said, her voice low and full of something he hadn't expected. "Gratitude, maybe. Or perhaps something else, something more personal." Lien swallowed hard, the weight of what he had just accomplished settling heavily on his shoulders. He felt a pang of guilt, of loss, something deeper than the exhaustion that had gripped him for hours. The memories of Earth, of everything he had left behind, seemed to resurface, but they felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. His family, his friends, his work, all of it felt like a fading echo, a dream he could barely hold on to. "I did what I had to do," he said quietly, though the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. "But I didn't have a choice. None of us did." G didn't respond at first, just sitting beside him in silence, the weight of the moment pressing in on both of them. The universe was saved, but it was saved at a cost neither of them could yet comprehend. The vast emptiness of space outside the ship mirrored the hollow ache inside him, and Lien found himself wondering if the stability they had fought for, if the universe itself, could ever feel whole again, knowing that it had been altered, irrevocably, by his sacrifice. "You're not alone in this," G finally said, her words soft but deliberate. "You might feel like you are, but you're not. We're all in this together." Lien couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh, though it was short and devoid of any real humor. "Together, huh?" His eyes met hers, and there was an almost imperceptible flicker of something between them, an unspoken understanding, a fleeting connection that had grown between them during their time in the heart of the crisis. "You know what the worst part of all this is?" "What?" G asked, her voice almost a whisper. "The worst part," Lien said, his voice strained, "is that I'll never be able to tell anyone. No one will ever know what we did here. What I did." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she simply nodded. The truth of it hung in the air, an unspoken burden that neither of them could ignore. Lien's heart ached as he realized that Earth, the life he had known, was now completely out of reach. He had severed that connection, and there would be no reunion. No going back. No one day where he could return to the people who had once known him. G looked at him then, her expression thoughtful. There was a sadness in her eyes, a kind of quiet understanding that made Lien wonder if she had felt the same way all along. But her words were direct. "It wasn't for nothing," she said. "The universe is still here. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough." Lien didn't reply at first. He wasn't sure how to respond, how to reconcile the empty weight of her words with the vast, impossible reality they had just created. But he knew, deep down, that she was right. He had done the impossible, and now the cosmos was breathing again, moving through its endless cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. The epoch drifted in space, and for the first time since they had entered the anomaly, Lien allowed himself a moment of peace. His thoughts slowed, and the cold exhaustion finally claimed him, sweeping away his anxiety, his doubts, and the ache in his heart. He closed his eyes, not wanting to feel the deep loneliness that was gnawing at him. He had lost Earth, but the universe was still here. He still had a purpose. It wasn't over yet. That he felt G shift beside him, and before he could stop himself, he spoke again, his voice barely more than a murmur. "Do you think the universe knows what we've done? Or is it all just random?" G remained silent for a long moment, her fingers tapping idly against the console in front of them. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, unwavering. "I think," she said softly, "the universe doesn't care about our little lives. But it's been shaped by them, by everything we do, even if we're too small to understand it. And sometimes, we do things that matter. Even if it's only to us." Lien closed his eyes again, the words sinking deep into his bones. He had done what he had to do. He had saved the universe. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. He let the silence of the ship wrap around him. He let the quiet of space soothe the storm inside. He didn't need to be anyone else. He didn't need to explain it. He had anchored the cosmos, and that was all that mattered. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lien let himself rest. And the universe, vast, infinite, and ever-changing, continued to spin, as it always had.